It was a gloomy April morning in 1883 when Dr. John Watson, awoke to find Sherlock Holmes pacing restlessly across the sitting-room floor of our Baker Street residence, his dressing gown trailing behind him like a dark mist as he moved in long, deliberate strides, the smoke from his pipe curling toward the ceiling in twisting patterns that reminded me of serpents climbing the air. The wind outside rattled the windows, and the streets below echoed with the distant clatter of horse hooves and carriage wheels. Yet Holmes seemed oblivious to the world beyond the glass. His eyes were fixed on something internal, some puzzle I could not yet see, and his whole posture carried an intensity I had come to recognize as a precursor to some strange and perplexing adventure. As I prepared to greet the day, a sudden knock, hurried and tremulous, sounded at our door. Startling me and even prompting Holmes to pause mid-step, Mrs. Hudson, troubled by the insistence of the visitor, ushered a young lady into our room without delay, her face pale as snow and framed by dark hair that fell loosely around her shoulders, her hands trembling as she removed her veil, revealing eyes wide with distress and exhaustion, as if she had not slept for many nights. She introduced herself in a voice that shook with each syllable. Her name was Helen Stoner, and she had come to us because she feared for her life. Holmes gestured gently toward the chair by the fireplace, urging her to sit, and I observed her closely, noticing the thinness of her frame, the nervous flitting of her eyes from one corner of the room to another, as if she expected some unseen assailant to emerge from the walls themselves. She spoke of her home, Stoke Moran, a once grand estate now decaying under the negligent hand of her stepfather, Dr. Grimsby Roylott, a violent man with a terrible temper, known for his abrupt outbursts and fierce strength, a former physician who had lived in India and returned with both wealth and rumors of deadly deeds. As she described him, her voice quivered like a reed in the wind. She recounted how he kept dangerous animals on the property, a cheetah and a baboon that roamed freely as if the estate were some savage menagerie rather than a country home, and how the very inhabitants lived in constant dread of the man's unpredictable wrath. Holmes listened in absolute stillness, his gaze sharp and unblinking, his hands steepled together beneath his chin, absorbing every word with the intensity of a hawk studying its prey. Helen told us that she and her twin sister, Julia, had once shared the hope of escaping their oppressive home through marriage, but 2 years earlier, Julia's engagement had been met with inexplicable hostility by Dr. Roylott, whose anger erupted like thunder in the household, shaking the walls with fear. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing when Helen explained how Julia's happiness was cut short by tragedy. The night before her wedding, Julia had died under mysterious circumstances. Her last words a terrified whisper about a speckled band, a phrase so odd and cryptic that even Helen could not begin to understand it. Julia had complained of strange whistling sounds in the night, and a faint metallic clink she could not identify, but no investigation had ever revealed the source. I could see Helen's breath quickening as she explained how she too had recently become engaged, and in the weeks following her fiancé's proposal, she had been moved into the very bedroom where her sister had died, by the suggestion of the very man she feared most, her stepfather. The room, she said, was adjacent to Dr. Roylott's own chamber, and a strange series of changes had been made to it. The bed was fastened to the floor so it could not be moved. A bell pull hung beside it that did not work, and a small ventilator connected it directly to Roylott's room rather than the outside air. Holmes pressed his fingertips together more tightly, and I could sense the gears of his mind turning with rapid precision as Helen described how she had begun to hear the same faint whistling at night that Julia once heard. A sound so soft yet chilling that it seemed to coil around her thoughts like an unseen creature slithering in the dark. Unable to bear the terror, she had fled under cover of early dawn to London, seeking Holmes's help. Her stepfather had followed her as far as town, she revealed, his presence like a shadow that clung to her even after she had escaped his house. Holmes rose to his full height and asked her if she had noticed any clues, any detail, no matter how small, that could illuminate her sister's mysterious death. She shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes, though she added that the mention of a speckled band was the only clue Julia ever gave before she collapsed. Holmes paced the room thoughtfully, then stopped abruptly and asked whether there were gypsies on the estate. Helen confirmed that a band of gypsies often camped near the property, and that Julia had once speculated her final words might have been referring to them. Holmes nodded, yet I could see from the faint glint in his eye that he was unsatisfied with this explanation. When he questioned Helen further, she mentioned that her stepfather frequently visited the gypsies and even adopted elements of their attire. Holmes stood motionless for a moment, and as he did, the morning light crept across the floor, illuminating the solemn features of our distressed visitor, who seemed to shrink further into her chair, as if the light itself might expose the terror that had driven her here. Suddenly, the door burst open, and a towering figure filled the entrance. His face dark with fury, and his large hands clenched like stone. Dr. Roylott himself had arrived, and his presence seemed to choke the very air of our sitting room. His eyes flashed with menace as he glared at us, and he warned Holmes with a voice sharp as a blade to stay out of his affairs, bending a metal poker in his hands as easily as one might bend a twig. The strength of the act both shocking and grotesque. Holmes watched with cold composure, saying nothing, his silence more powerful than any confrontation. Roylott stormed out after delivering his threat, leaving behind the twisted metal as a reminder of the strength we were to contend with. Helen leaned forward, fear and apology mixing in her face. But Holmes simply placed the poker back into shape with surprising ease, his lean hands steady, though lacking the brutal force Roylott had shown seconds earlier. He assured Helen that she need not worry, telling her that he would investigate the matter personally. The fear in her features softened slightly, replaced by a fragile hope as she prepared to return home. Holmes told her to signal us by lighting a lamp in her window should she require immediate assistance. Helen nodded, thanked us with trembling sincerity, and left as quietly as she had arrived, her footsteps fading like the last beats of a heart before sleep. Holmes turned to me then, his expression sharp and decisive, telling me to ready myself to journey with him to Stoke Moran at once, for he believed we must investigate the rooms before any further harm befell our client, Holmes N. I set out for Stoke Moran that very afternoon, the sky heavy with clouds that cast dim shadows over the countryside, as if the weather itself sensed the dread waiting for us at the old estate. And throughout the journey Holmes remained unusually quiet, his eyes fixed on the passing scenery, yet clearly seeing something else entirely, as though the fields and trees were merely a curtain behind which the true stage of events lay hidden. When we arrived, the building stood in weary silence, its stonework cracked, ivy crawling up its walls like dark veins, and several windows boarded up as though the house were trying to shield itself from the world, giving the impression of decay not only in structure but in spirit. A baboon lurked in the branches of a nearby tree, watching us with eerie curiosity, and a cheetah paced lazily across the lawn, its movements both graceful and unsettling, confirming Helen's claim that the estate was more a wild enclosure than a home. Helen greeted us near the gate with anxious relief and led us quietly toward her room, her voice barely above a whisper as she described how her stepfather was away on business until evening, giving us only a narrow window to examine the house without interference. Holmes insisted we first inspect Dr. Roylott's chamber, but Helen hesitated, her fear evident, though she relented when Holmes assured her that the investigation would remain discreet. Roylott's room was filled with heavy furniture and odd objects from India whips, spears, strange idols with grotesque expressions, and a small safe against the wall, its metal surface scratched as though something had clawed at it, and beside it a dish of milk. Curious in its placement, considering there was no cat in the house, a detail Holmes noted with a quiet nod. He examined everything carefully, his movements deliberate, his long fingers tracing the room as though reading a hidden script. And then he shifted his attention to the ventilator connecting Roylett's chamber with Helen's, inspecting it with keen interest, remarking that the opening was unusually small, yet oddly unnecessary. For a ventilator between two inside rooms served no proper purpose, especially when the air could not flow outside. We crossed into Helen's room next, and Holmes immediately focused on the bed that was fastened to the floor, testing it with a tug that revealed its complete immobility. An unnatural decision that ensured the occupant would lie in only one position throughout the night. The bell pull hung just above it, but when Holmes pulled it, no bell sounded, and he discovered it was merely a decorative cord attached to nothing, its purpose neither useful nor harmless. He leaned closer toward the ventilator once more, and I watched as his eyes lit briefly with a spark of revelation. Though he said nothing, his silence far more telling than any words. He then examined the walls, the carpet, the window locks, and even the fireplace, searching for any detail that might align with Helen's story of mysterious whistles and a death tied to a speckled band. When his investigation concluded, Holmes instructed Helen to remain calm and to continue sleeping in her stepfather's room that night, just as Roylett had arranged, but with one change: she was to leave a lamp burning in the window as a signal for us to enter. Her eyes widened with fear at the thought, but Holmes assured her that she would not be left alone, and that we would be watching, ready to intervene should any danger arise. She nodded reluctantly, her voice faint as she agreed, trusting Holmes's judgment as though it were her last shield against the unknown threat that stalked her nights. As evening fell, Holmes and I returned to a nearby inn to wait for darkness, and over a modest meal he finally spoke, his tone low yet certain, telling me that we were dealing with something far more deliberate and sinister than mere coincidence, that the gypsies on the grounds were nothing but a misdirection, and that Roylett's motives were rooted in greed, for he wished to prevent his stepdaughters from marrying and claiming their rightful inheritance. The wind outside grew colder, rattling the shutters like restless fingers, and though Holmes's reasoning seemed sound, we still lacked the final connection between inheritance, the strange bedroom arrangements, and Julia's final cryptic words about a speckled band. When the night deepened, Holmes rose with resolve and instructed me to bring my revolver, saying only that we would need it not against a man, but something else entirely. We approached the estate again under the cover of shadows, and Helen's lamp glowed dimly through the window like a trembling star caught in the darkness, signaling us to proceed. Holmes unlocked the window silently, and we slipped inside Helen's room, careful not to disturb anything, and positioned ourselves in the gloom, hidden from sight yet fully alert. The room felt colder than it had before, its silence heavy, pressing upon us as if the walls listened and waited with bated breath. Holmes extinguished the lamp, but warned me to remain perfectly still and not to strike out at any sound I heard unless he gave the order, for attack without understanding could be fatal. Hours crept by with agonizing slowness, the moonlight faint on the walls, and every distant creak of the house seemed magnified until it pulsed through the darkness like a living presence. I strained my ears for any hint of the mysterious whistle Helen had described, and as the clock ticked nearer to midnight, the silence grew so deep that it felt like the air itself was listening, as though the house anticipated the unfolding of some hidden ritual. Then, suddenly, the faintest sound emerged, a soft hiss, barely audible, slithering through the ventilator with chilling intent. And in that moment, the reality of Julia's terror became horribly clear, as though her dying fear had returned to haunt the room. Unseen yet unmistakably alive, the hissing grew sharper, more focused, like a thin jet of air forced through clenched teeth. And Holmes's hand shot up in warning, urging me to remain immobile as he leaned forward with the swift precision of a striking predator. his eyes fixed on the ventilator as though he could see through its darkness into Roylett's very intentions. And for a moment, all I could hear was that sinister whisper of sound creeping closer. Then Holmes sprang up and lashed out at the bell pull with his cane, striking it again and again with fierce force, the motion so rapid that I scarcely understood what was happening until a low, furious rattling noise erupted from above us, followed by a sudden writhing movement, and I glimpsed something pale and coiled retreating rapidly through the ventilator, its shape so fleeting that my mind rebelled at the thought of what it might be, though its motion was unmistakably alive and filled with venomous intent. Holmes struck once more and then leapt back beside me, his breathing taut but controlled, whispering for me not to move until he gave the word, and we waited, hearing now a strange, muffled thud from the adjoining room, followed by a heavy, choking cry that rose harshly and then ceased abruptly, plunging the house into a silence more chilling than the darkness itself. Holmes motioned toward the door that led into Roylett's room, and we crept forward, careful to make no sound despite the pounding of my heart and the trembling anticipation in my limbs. And when Holmes opened the door, the lantern in his hand revealed a sight that, though far from gruesome in description, froze me with its dreadful implication. Dr. Greensby Roylett lay slumped in a chair, his body unnaturally still, his eyes staring wide and his face locked in the ghastly rigidity of shock, while coiled tightly around his brow was a small speckled snake, its patterned skin shining faintly in the lamp's light, its hissing now subdued but unmistakably satisfied as it rested like some grotesque crown upon its master. Holmes immediately stepped forward and drove the creature back toward the safe using the poker, his movements unflinching, and with a swift flip he sent it inside before slamming the door shut and turning the key. His expression grim yet resolute, and he stood there for a moment, watching the metal box as though ensuring no further evil could escape it. He then straightened, his voice low and controlled as he explained what he had known Roylett had been using this deadly swamp adder, one of the most poisonous snakes in existence, trained to return through the ventilator when summoned by the sound of a whistle and lured with the dish of milk, not as food but as conditioning, his cruel scheme devised so that the snake, once climbing down the bell rope to the bed below, would strike the sleeping victim without fail. The ventilator's placement, the immovable bed, the useless bell pull, all were pieces of a method calculated to kill without human touch, ensuring that no murder weapon would ever be found. And Julia's last words had been a desperate attempt to describe what she saw in her final moments, a speckled band, not of cloth or gypsy decoration, but of living death released upon her in the darkness. Holmes added that tonight, when he struck at the snake to stop its attack on Helen, it must have turned back in terror and fury, striking the very man who had sought to wield it as a weapon. And so Roylett became the victim of his own monstrous design. We left the house quietly and returned to Helen, who waited in trembling uncertainty until Holmes assured her that the threat was gone, though he softened his explanation with mercy, sparing her the full detail of her stepfather's end. And she wept with a mixture of relief and sorrow, for though Roylett had been cruel, he was still the only guardian she had known. As dawn crept over the countryside and the first pale light touched the estate, Holmes and I departed, leaving behind the decaying halls of Stoke Moran and the memory of a twisted ambition undone. And as we rode back to London, Holmes sat in thoughtful silence, his gaze distant as though contemplating the thin boundary between justice and consequence, telling me only once we neared Baker Street that he felt no remorse in playing the part of fate in a case where evil had crafted its own destruction. 6 months had passed since the strange and fatal affair at Stoke Moran, and though the storms of that night had long faded into memory, the echo of its consequences lingered like frost upon my mind, for I often found Holmes seated by the fireplace in our Baker Street rooms, his eyes fixed not on the crackling coals, but upon some inward landscape, as though some fragment of that case still gnawed restlessly at his thoughts. Yet whenever I inquired, he merely replied that it was the habit of the mind to return to unfinished patterns, even when the matter seemed conclusively resolved. For my part, I believe that time had brought its healing power to Miss Helen Stoner, now Mrs. Helen Armitage, having married her fiancé at last, and settling into a modest yet tranquil home on the outskirts of Surrey, far from the decaying estate and the venomous scheme that had nearly claimed her life. And though Holmes never expressed sentiment, I noticed a faint satisfaction in him whenever her name was mentioned, as though a rare justice had taken root in a world where cruelty too often flourished unchecked. Yet fate, which so often wounds through unseen movements, seemed unwilling to leave the memory of Stoke Moran undisturbed, for on a grey and heavy autumn morning, when mist crept through the London streets like a silent tide, and the smell of rain lingered in the air, we heard once more the hurried knock of a visitor at our door, though this time the sound was softer. As though a weary hand hesitated even while seeking help, Mrs. Hudson ushered the caller inside, and to our astonishment it was Helen herself, her face pale not with the stark terror we once witnessed, but with the sorrowful exhaustion of one who has seen grief return in unexpected form. And she clutched in her gloves a sealed envelope, its edges stained with damp, as though she had carried it through rain without regard for her comfort. Holmes rose slowly, and though his features remained calm, I saw the spark of intense curiosity ignite behind his eyes, for Helen's presence alone suggested that some shadow from her past had reached toward her once more. She sat with a trembling breath and explained that she had received, without sender's name or signature, a letter 3 days prior, a letter composed of a single sentence written in a heavy, blotting ink that seemed to press the words into the paper with unusual force, as though the writer's hand bore either great trembling or great rage. She handed it to Holmes, and the sentence, stark and chilling in its brevity, read, "A serpent does not die when its master falls." These words struck me as a cruel attempt to resurrect fear that ought to have been buried with Dr. Grimsby Roylott. Yet Helen insisted that the letter was not the only source of her distress. She had heard strange noises in the night, faint scraping sounds along the walls of her new home, not unlike the slithering whisper that once haunted her bedroom at Stoke Moran. And though she tried to dismiss these as tricks of imagination born from past trauma, the sounds persisted, always between the hours of 1 and 2 after midnight, as though something waited for that precise span of darkness to make its presence known. Worse still, she had discovered on her windowsill a small object, left there as though placed deliberately, a strip of cloth patterned with pale irregular spots, like a crude imitation of the speckled band that had signaled her sister's doom. The cloth reeked faintly of strong oil, its scent heavy and nauseating, and Helen swore she had never seen it before. Nor could she account for how it came to be there, for her windows were always locked at night and her husband slept soundly beside her, unaware of any disturbance. As she spoke, I felt the air in our sitting room grow heavier, as if the memory of that accursed snake coiled back into our thoughts, though Holmes remained as composed as ever, tapping a single finger lightly against his knee as his gaze swept over Helen, the envelope, and the ominous scrap of fabric she now revealed from her bag. He asked if she had noticed anyone suspicious near her home, but she shook her head, saying only that a man claiming to be an agent of an Indian imports company had once called, asking for charitable donations to support displaced workers returning from overseas. But she had been too unsettled by his aggressive manner to entertain him, and he had left abruptly when her husband approached the door. Holmes seized upon this detail with notable interest, asking whether the man had mentioned India specifically in his appeal, to which Helen confirmed, adding that he wore a ring engraved with a strange emblem, something like an intertwined shape of vines or serpents, though she could not recall the design with precision. Holmes fell into a contemplative silence, and I could tell he was making connections that had not yet dawned upon us. For his expression darkened in a manner that suggested old wounds of the case had begun to bleed anew. And his voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of something he had suspected long before. Something he had never shared even with me. Holmes's expression stiffened as he examined the letter on our table. The wax seal bearing the faint imprint of a serpent coiled around a spear. And though Roylott was long dead, the mark seemed to breathe with a life of its own, as if his influence had never died with him, but merely dissolved into a deeper shadow that found ways to creep back into our path. Helen, now living quietly with her aunt in a small, ivy-draped cottage near Harrow, wrote that she had begun hearing a faint, rhythmic tapping at night against her window. Not from wind or tree branches, but something deliberate, as though someone or something were trying to imitate the same unnatural pattern she once heard from the ventilator of Stoke Moran, and she confessed that she had dismissed it as nerves until a few days prior, when a small scrap of paper was slipped under her door bearing only that same serpent sigil and a single line written in old-fashioned script. "The debt remains." Holmes tapped his fingers against the letter thoughtfully, not with immediate urgency, but with a quiet attentiveness that told me he sensed a depth of meaning hidden in this message, one that extended beyond simple intimidation. And he murmured that some debts were not of money or property, but of knowledge someone feared Holmes possessed, or perhaps knowledge Holmes had yet to uncover. And the idea that someone might be observing Helen silently, waiting for the right moment, caused the old chill from Stoke Moran to seep back into the room, as if the swampy breath of the Roylott estate had found its way to Baker Street. He rose, took his coat, and informed me that we would visit Helen at once, and the sense that something unfinished had been roused from the past clung to us like the smell of damp stone, one that could not be brushed away by ordinary daylight, leaving me to wonder if the ghost of a man might linger not in spirit, but in the ambitions he left behind for others to carry. Holmes and I departed without delay, the cold wind slicing down Baker Street as though winter itself were conspiring to push us onward. And the cab ride to Harrow felt strangely prolonged, for Holmes remained unusually silent, eyes half closed, as if listening not to our surroundings, but to some echo within his own mind, the kind that emerges only when a puzzle has the power to alter the course of things yet unseen. By the time we reached the quiet lane leading to Helen's cottage, the air seemed weighted with a damp heaviness, the sort that clings to old gardens and forgotten cellars. And when Helen opened the door at our knock, she appeared outwardly calmer than in the days after her sister's death. Yet her eyes held a faint tremor, not of panic, but of endurance fraying at its edges, as though her nights had become longer than any sunrise could mend. She invited us in, and the interior of the cottage was modest, warm with a small fire, yet the corners seemed oddly shadowed, as if the light refused to occupy certain spaces fully. And she produced the scrap of paper bearing the serpent symbol, its ink slightly smudged, as though someone's fingertips had lingered too long upon it, or as if the paper had been damp before it reached her. A detail Holmes examined with unusual intensity. After a few minutes, he asked Helen whether she had noticed strangers nearby, anyone watching the cottage, anyone who seemed to wander past more than once. And she hesitated before mentioning a man in a long coat who stood several evenings at the edge of the lane, half turned away as though merely waiting for someone, yet always positioned where the light from her window would fall faintly upon him, the description of his stillness striking Holmes with particular interest. Holmes stepped to the window, observing the lane outside, and murmured that persistent observation without approach implied not simple threat, but anticipation, an intent held in reserve, waiting for the moment when something expected might occur. And this uncertainty, this sense that a new player acted not from Roylott's hatred, but from a deeper, unfathomed motive spread through the room like a slow creeping fog. As we spoke further, The rhythmic tapping Helen mentioned returned faintly against the glass. So soft it could have been imagined, yet too precise to be mistaken for wind. And all three of us turned toward the sound. The small house seemingly shrinking inward, walls tightening like lungs held beyond comfort. And Holmes leaned forward slightly without touching the curtains, listening, his eyes sharpening into a silent calculation that told me we had not left Stoke Moran behind, but merely stepped into the continuation of its hidden story. Holmes allowed the tapping to continue a moment longer before drawing back from the window, with the curious restraint of a man who chooses to observe rather than interfere. And he asked Helen whether the sound always occurred at the same hour, to which she answered that it often came shortly after dusk, but never later than midnight, as if bound to a schedule that held meaning only to the one behind it. He motioned for us to sit quietly, and we did so without lighting any additional lamps, letting the cottage dim to near twilight, the fire lowering itself into a dull amber glow, until we seemed to exist in a room that was neither dark nor illuminated, but suspended somewhere between, a condition that mirrored the uncertainty surrounding us. The tapping grew slightly louder, deliberate enough to suggest a pattern. 3 short taps, a pause, then 2 more, faintly echoing the morbid rhythm that had once haunted the walls of Stoke Moran. And Helen's breath caught in her chest, though she uttered no cry, only clasped her hands tightly until her knuckles whitened like porcelain. Holmes whispered that we must remain still, and I felt the peculiar sensation that the intruder outside was not merely knocking for attention, but communicating in a code that only those familiar with the past would understand, as though we were unwilling participants in a ritual we had yet to decipher. After several minutes, the tapping ceased abruptly, replaced by a long silence that seemed to stretch wider than the room, and Holmes slowly parted the curtain by barely an inch, observing the lane, then closed it again with no change in expression, though his voice, when he spoke, carried a note of decisive clarity as he informed Helen that the man outside was not trying to frighten her, but to verify her presence, confirming that she still lived here and still followed a life of predictable routine. A statement that sent a colder shiver through me than any hint of danger, for it implied planning, patience, and a motive that did not begin with hatred or madness, but calculation. Helen asked, in a faint voice, what the intruder wanted from her, and Holmes replied that it was not her personally they sought, but something connected to her through inheritance, though not of money, not of land, but of knowledge she did not possess, yet one connected to the secrets her stepfather had guarded obsessively, secrets he had not protected for himself alone, but for others who now demanded their continuation. Holmes stood, announcing he would inspect the grounds at daybreak and that we must remain calm through the night. Yet as he spoke, a distant whistle sounded from somewhere near the end of the lane, brief and low, as though signaling the departure of something that had completed its nightly task. And Helen's home seemed to shrink once more into a hush that did not break even when the fire crackled, for the quiet that followed felt heavy, like the pause between a question and its unwanted answer. Holmes sat through the remainder of the night without sleep, pacing occasionally near the window and pausing every so often, as though listening for something just beyond the reach of ordinary hearing. And the dim firelight cast shifting shapes on the walls that appeared to follow him, as if mimicking his movements in slow distortion, though he did not acknowledge them and focused solely on the faint impressions outside. When morning finally broke through the horizon with a muted gray dawn rather than a bright one, Holmes stepped out into the garden without a word, and I accompanied him while Helen remained inside, exhausted by her restless night. The garden, though small, carried a quiet sense of neglect, the tall grass moving slightly in the faint wind as though stirred by something that preferred to remain unseen. And Holmes examined the soil near the window with remarkable precision, Crouching low and brushing lightly against the earth were faint depressions hinted at footprints intentionally obscured. The heel facing away from the window, as if the intruder stood always in retreat mode, prepared to vanish at the slightest disturbance, which suggested discipline and patience rather than curiosity. Holmes traced the faint marks further toward the lane, where the earth became flatter and less willing to hold such impressions, and he paused beside a patch of ivy-covered stone that bordered the cottage, lifting a broken set of twigs with the calm interest of a botanist, remarking that someone had shifted them deliberately, using them perhaps to conceal something or to test whether they were observed. And this act of quiet manipulation hinted at a mind accustomed to secrecy rather than intimidation. He followed the lane a short distance until it curved toward a small field, and he halted abruptly at the sight of a discarded scrap of cloth snagged on a thorn bush, its color a dull brown like an old coat, and he removed it carefully, noting a faint scent of pungent chemicals, something industrial yet not fresh, as though the wearer frequented places forgotten by common passage. And he tucked the cloth away without further comment, though I noticed his eyes sharpen with an intensity I had rarely seen except in the most grave of cases. Upon returning to the cottage, Holmes asked Helen if she had ever encountered anyone in her stepfather's life who seemed to hold power over him, rather than the reverse. And she thought deeply before recalling a man who visited Stoke Moran on rare occasions. A man Roylott never introduced to the family, but whom he treated with a peculiar mixture of irritation and reluctant respect. Someone who arrived unexpectedly and always departed before nightfall, his visits short and silent like a passing storm that left the air disturbed long after he disappeared. She remembered fragments only: a tall figure with a heavy coat, a narrow face marked by sternness rather than malice, and eyes that seemed to measure the room rather than look at those in it. And Holmes listened with rapt attention, asking if she recalled a name. But all she could remember was hearing her stepfather mutter once under his breath, not in greeting, but in annoyance, calling the man Garth, whether as a name or a curse she could not discern. Yet the sound of it seemed important enough to turn Holmes's expression contemplative, as though the name were less a personal identity and more a key that unlocked a door long sealed. We returned to Baker Street by late afternoon, the sky heavy with low clouds as though the air itself was reluctant to grant us clarity. And Holmes, upon arriving, immediately plunged into the depth of his records, searching through old newspaper clippings, criminal registries, and colonial reports that seldom saw daylight. For he was convinced that the man observing Helen was not a random menace, but someone who operated beneath the surface of society, someone who moved in the shadows of institutions, and whose relationship with Roylott was built not on familial bonds or friendship, but on shared undertakings that required silence. Hours passed in relentless research, Holmes's fingers dancing over papers like a musician analyzing sheet music, until he paused at a faded report mentioning a man named Garth Fenwick, associated with clandestine shipments and chemical acquisitions in India during the same years. Roylott studied exotic species and venom experiments, and though Fenwick was never charged, his name surfaced repeatedly among whispers of secret research, black market trade, and unexplained disappearances of rare animals, suggesting a mind that saw nature not as a subject of curiosity, but as a weapon to be mastered. Holmes closed the book with sudden resolve, stating that Fenwick likely continued Roylott's work, or perhaps even oversaw it from afar, expecting Roylott to deliver results that never came due to his death. And now Helen, as the last link to that halted work, was being monitored to ensure nothing was lost or revealed. And Holmes added that such men valued knowledge above lives, seeing people merely as stepping stones in their pursuit of forbidden science. He motioned that we must locate Fenwick before Fenwick acted again, for it was not simply Helen at risk, but whatever Roylott had been preparing to unleash, something unfinished that now lingered without a guardian, something Fenwick likely intended to reclaim. And Holmes's tone carried the kind of urgency that revealed we were not trying to prevent a crime, but to stop the completion of something already long in progress. The days that followed were filled with subtle surveillance, timed observations, and quiet inquiries into warehouses, ship docks, and chemical suppliers who hinted at dealings with a silent, stern customer whose identity they could never fully confirm, but whose payments arrived with unwavering precision. And Holmes traced these scattered clues like threads on a tapestry, each one leading closer to a web spun not out of greed or madness, but of methodical ambition, a pursuit that no longer required Roylott to be alive to continue its purpose. We eventually discovered that Fenwick operated through a small, nondescript laboratory on the outskirts of London, hidden behind the facade of a disused veterinary depot, its windows shuttered and its owner scarcely seen except during late hours when the fog was thickest and the streets emptied of witnesses. And Holmes decided we would visit under the guise of routine inquiry, though his posture suggested we would uncover truths far beyond our expectations. The night of our visit, the air carried an unnatural stillness, the fog curling around the building as though trying to conceal it further. And Holmes motioned for silence as we approached, examining the door and noting faint marks of frequent usage despite its outward appearance of abandonment. He listened, not for footsteps or voices, but for vibrations in the air, the whisper of movement behind walls, and after a long moment, he knocked lightly in a pattern of 3 and 2 taps, the very same rhythm we heard at Helen's window, and the door opened slightly, not by human hands, but by the subtle release of a mechanical latch, as though someone expected that signal, confirming that the code had been used before by those who understood its meaning. As we stepped inside, the interior smelled of chemicals, dust, and something faintly organic, though not rot or decay, but the lingering scent of experiments conducted with precision and clinical detachment. And the room's walls were lined with shelves holding sealed containers labeled with scientific notations, some of which referenced species we knew Roylott had studied, and others whose names suggested dangers far more obscure. The shadows in the corridors seemed to move with our footsteps, stretching and receding as if unwilling to fully reveal what lay within them. And we found ourselves led further inward by the architecture itself, until we stood in a wider room illuminated by a single hanging lamp, beneath which stood a tall man in a long coat, his narrow face composed not with anger or surprise, but with calm expectation, as though Holmes's visit was not an intrusion but an appointment long overdue. The man introduced himself as Fenwick without hesitation, his voice controlled and devoid of inflection, and he regarded us with the analytical gaze of someone accustomed to examining specimens rather than conversing with equals, stating with clinical certainty that Roylott's death was an unfortunate delay to their endeavors, but not the end. And he implied that Helen's continued safety depended upon the retrieval of certain research notes and samples Roylott left behind, materials he assumed Holmes had access to or could locate, given his reputation for uncovering what others could not. Holmes asked calmly why such knowledge was worth surveillance and intimidation, and Fenwick's expression shifted only slightly as he stated that nature held powers beyond law or morality, and those willing to wield it without hesitation would reshape the future while others hesitated behind ethics constructed by fear. He stepped closer, his eyes holding an intensity like cold flame, and he remarked that Holmes had unwittingly placed himself between progress and its rightful heir, warning that obstruction would leave consequences, not as threats of retaliation, but as inevitabilities inherent to those who disrupted the evolution of science. Holmes, in his quiet and razor-edged manner, responded that true science did not seek power over life but understanding of it, and those who wielded it without conscience were not pioneers but parasites who corrupted discovery with ambition. And Fenwick's expression hardened for the first time, revealing that he had underestimated Holmes not intellectually, but philosophically. The air seemed to tense as though the room itself awaited the outcome of their confrontation. And Holmes declared that he would ensure Helen remained protected, not because she possessed knowledge, but precisely because she did not, stating that innocence must never be sacrificed on the altar of secrets it cannot comprehend. Fenwick replied that protection would only delay the inevitable, for knowledge buried always finds a way to surface. And Holmes countered that it would surface under the right hands, not those who believed progress justified cruelty. The conversation ended like a blade sliding into its sheath, quiet, unresolved, yet loaded with future violence, not of bodies, but of intellects colliding beneath the fabric of society. Holmes and I departed without physical conflict, yet the air felt charged with the awareness that battle had been declared not with weapons, but with discoveries. And Holmes knew that Fenwick would not relent as long as the possibility of Roylett's secrets remained beyond his grasp. Upon returning to Baker Street, Holmes drafted plans to secure the remaining documents hidden within Stoke Moran's ruins, determined to find and destroy any remnants that could empower Fenwick's pursuits. And he prepared for a journey back to the estate, knowing that the secrets we believed buried had merely waited for their next keeper. The case no longer concerned justice for one family, but a battle against a legacy of weaponized knowledge. And as Holmes stood by the window that night, the shadows of London seemed to bend toward him as though listening for his next move. While somewhere in the fog, Fenwick no doubt prepared his own. Thus the mystery did not close with the death of Roylett, but expanded into a conflict born from his obsessions, now inherited by those ruthless enough to continue it. And Helen, though unaware of its full depth, remained a symbol not of danger, but of the very innocence that ambition sought to exploit. Holmes would not allow her to become a casualty in a war between minds. And so the path ahead led not only to Stoke Moran, but to the heart of a darkness that science, in immoral hands, could create without needing superstition or ghosts. A darkness Holmes intended to confront before it could step fully into the world.